Hey, this is Enaa, in with you in the fight back. And I got asked a question, and it's rather personal, but I don't actually mind answering it. And someone asked me, how did I become a communist, a Marxist? And I'll answer that for you, because everyone has their own story about how they adopt the views they adopt. Mine, I guess, starts when I was about 13. Um, I grew up in a rather comfortable, you know, semi middle class lifestyle. I really didn't know much about the world, what's going on. And I was, even as a 13-year-old, I was interested in like history and stuff, but I didn't perceive deeper meanings and causes. It was just like great stories to me. So it's like, I was pretty sheltered in many respects from what's going on around me. And when I was about 13, almost 14, my parents got divorced, and that was pretty traumatic for me. And I remember, questioning why did this happen? Why did this bad stuff happen to me? And that question dogged me for a long time. And through various circumstances, about 8 months after they divorced, I moved in with my father. And suddenly everything changed rather drastically. I mean, before that, in that whole divorce period, I was pretty alienated from the few friends I had. I didn't try in school or anything, so things were spiraling away. And I remember, moving in with him. Suddenly, the whole class situation changed, and it wasn't like everything just wasn't. Before it was almost like a paradise. It felt like, but then it just wasn't. And I remember he would go from job to job, and he never could seem to make enough money. Always complaining about the workplace, and of course, I would have to listen to this, and I would wonder why. I couldn't perceive deeper patterns yet or anything like that. And the question still persisted with me. I like, why this horrible stuff happening, what's going on in the world, and I just couldn't stand like this suffering like I was feeling, and I could beginning to kind of perceive it around me, but still I really couldn't make sense of it. It just didn't really fit. So this was towards the end of middle school, so like eighth grade, and then into ninth grade when I was roughly 15. Um, Most of my fellow high school students, at least the ones I knew, and some, if they watch this, may be surprised. I didn't really perceive most of them as rather sympathetic to the like what was going on in the world around them. Because I was very conscious about not being as well off as most of them. I'm not saying I was in dire poverty. I was not, but that terror of that's where I could end up, because suddenly going from middle class to not was just quite a shock to the my whole system. And I remember it felt like, and as I went through high school, I swear that everyone seemed to have their own car except for me. And it was, everyone was always keeping up with the latest gadgets and everything. I remember I must have been about 18 before I think I got a CD player. I was using cassettes before then. But, thing, and I remember one time my father, we were out, and he was complaining about work, as he always did. But he added something new to the mix this time, something that really made me think. And he mentioned something positive about the Soviet Union. And I was brought up in towards the tail end of the Cold War, and I got the same crap indoctrination that we all get here in the U.S. So I recognize all the stuff about you know you know communism bad, socialism bad. It was all ends in the gulag and all that stuff. I had all that in my consciousness, and suddenly, like, whoa, you're saying something good about this? What the hell do you mean? And he said about job for life, free health care, a decent standard of living. I'm like, okay, I'm confused. And so I think after that, I actually went into when we got home because we were out to eat. I opened the dictionary and I actually looked up, well, what is communism, and I actually found the definition appealing. Like, I'm like, well, in that case, what actually is capitalism? Because it's one of those unspoken assumptions that unless you actually ask it, you're just going to accept it. At least that's how I perceived it at the time, and to a certain extent, I still do. And I looked at it, I'm like, oh, this actually doesn't sound all that good. So I'm like, I was sympathetic to this idea, sympathetic to what I heard, but I still had all these the anti-communist cliches and biases in my head that I, of course, had to grow up with. So I'm like, well, Stalin doesn't seem like that great a person, and there's a lot of stuff about the Soviet Union because, well, I mean, this is a great idea, but look at what they did. I mean, the Soviet Union wasn't there anymore. This was the tail end of the 90s. There was no revolution on the horizon. That's seemingly the end of history. This is um, the Clinton era and all this stuff. This was it seemed like the end of ideology. So I did a little more investigating. Turned out my father had taken Russian history courses in high school and still had some of the textbooks that he had used, which actually he had a selection of Leon Trotsky's writings and some of the famous Trotsky biography by Isaac Deutscher, The Prophet, Armed, Unarmed, and Outcast. So as I was reading through this, I feel Trotsky presented a very clear and stark alternative, and showed me that what Stalin stood for wasn't necessarily communism, that there was an alternative. And again, I was still a teenager at this point, so I'm like many teenagers, your interests can change and it can be a fad, but I stuck with it. I would read this, and slowly and surely, I was put meaning it would lead to Marx and Lenin, and there's also my father was actually a great admirer of Nikolai Bukharin, so I actually ended up reading a great deal of his writings, which were actually quite easy to read and really helped put a lot of it in perspective. But certainly it helped put everything. It was like finding a missing piece in a puzzle that just laid it all out there. Now, since then, I've done so much more investigating that you say to me now something nice about the Soviet Union. My father was talking about Soviet Union, say the 70s. I tend not to have quite a positive view of it, but still, it broke through those barriers. It got me questioning. It got me doing stuff on my own. And he never was a communist or anything like that, but and I think he was probably rather disappointed when I adopted that label for myself. But from there, my development went through many contradictions and zigzags. But I've remained pretty much the what I adopted when I was 15. I really have seen no reason to discard it, and that's pretty much the reason I became what I am. And obviously, it mushroomed into history, which ended up being my undergraduate and graduate major. So it was a good fit there, and it influenced as I wrote adventure stories and novels and such later on. So that's it. I mean, you can ask further questions. I just want to tell you the blog gets updated. There's actually some of the transcripts for older videos are actually going to be up there. Not exact transcripts, but mostly I'm just copying my notes and putting them there. So if you find it easy to read some of them, you'll as opposed to watching, you'll get it there. So Lars Lees Lenin, that's up. Jean-Paul Sartre, Estevan Mazaros, that's up. I have no intention of doing right now of doing most of the FAQs. I kind of like how they came video wise. Some of the more theoretical stuff I would like to put in writing. I want to do some Slavoj Žižek. I want to do Alain Badiou on St. Paul, the foundation of universalism. That's going to take some time. I have stuff on Herbert Marcuse. It just takes time to get notes together. None of the Star Trek stuff will be there, and I do have some Star Trek reviews I'd like to do. And I haven't got much feedback on my novel, but if you would, I don't know if or when I'm going to put up Chapter 2, but that is pretty much it. Please leave feedback. So this is Enaa, until next time.